Fantastical and supernatural elements have always played a major role in literature, but fantasy, in a modern sense, emerged as a genre in the late Victorian era, when the influence of the Church upon society lessened, granting artists an unprecedented freedom of expression. The definition of the fantasy genre proposed by John Clute in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy is as follows. A fantasy text is a self-coherent narrative. When set in the primary world, it tells a story which is impossible in the world as we perceive it. When set in a secondary world, that other world will be impossible, though stories set there may be possible in its terms. The term self-coherent suggests a contrast between fantasy and other forms of the fantastic. Certain kinds of narrative presentation of the unreal do not induce in the reader the sense that a coherent world is being presented through the text, but rather a setting subordinated to our world, the primary world. In fantasy, the secondary world is an invented world with laws of its own, impossible but internally coherent, in which that tale is possible. In the 50s, with the publication of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, a new coherence was given to the genre. His was not the first modern fantasy, but Tolkien's fantasy is the most typical, not just because of the imaginative scope with which he invested his tale, but also because of the immense popularity that resulted. Indeed, the works we recognize as fantasy tend to resemble Lord of the Rings in three fundamental ways: content, structure, and reader response. The essential content is the impossible, that is, a violation of reality as it is generally conceived. Fantasy has a characteristic structure. It starts with a problem and ends with a resolution. This is not to say that fantasy must necessarily have a happy ending, but in each case the initial problem is solved. If it were otherwise, if, for instance, the ring were not destroyed, but simply hidden, or if Sauron managed to get it back, then we would not have the structural completeness of fantasy, but the truncated story forms of horror or absurdism. Tolkien himself believed that such an upward movement is inextricably connected with fantasy. Every fantastic tale must have such a final turn towards deliverance, for which he proposed the term eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophe is essential to induce in the reader a certain response, wonder. Wonder is an alternate form of estrangement, an artistic procedure that aims at making common and familiar things appear distant and strange to the reader. Similarly, fantasy-induced wonder allows readers to reconsider reality, which appears dull because of modern and social constructs, restoring it to the vividness of childhood. Fantasy has always had a prominent space in cinema. Thanks to its visual nature, cinema appeared as the perfect medium through which to depict fantasy. Think about Georges Méliès, one of the forefathers of cinema, who was the first to adapt both fantasy and science fiction to film. But fantasy reaches its cinematographic potential in the 90s with digital technology. Thanks to it, the most magical and spectacular aspects of fantasy can be finally recreated realistically. This constitutes a beneficial climate for fantasy, especially pre-existing print series that attract a pre-constituted fan base. In this period, Peter Jackson starts working on this adaptation of the quintessential fantasy saga, Lord of the Rings. Adaptation is a translation process of sorts through which a new work originates from a pre-existing one. The new work does not utilize, or only partly utilizes, the same medias as the original work. This specific kind of translation is called intersemiotic. More than focusing on the words, emphasis is on the overall message that needs to be conveyed. Thus, the translator, instead of paying attention to the verbal signs, concentrates more on the information that is to be delivered. Through this procedure, a book can be transformed into a film. There are three main approaches to adaptation. In the first, just a few elements of the original work remain. The derivative work may deviate from the original through endless variations. In the second, the connection between original and derivative work is stronger. Only the most meaningful moments are adapted, because they are considered sufficient to communicate the deep meaning of the text to the viewer. The third approach is about transmediality, that is, those stories which are meant to be told through various different mediums. Nowadays, with the rise of new media, internet, television, video games, which include cinema and literature in a transmedial net, this strategy is extremely popular. Cinema and television are not the only sectors that understood and used the various potentialities of fantasy. The gaming industry has always drawn full hands from fantasy literature, and this has led to the birth and development of forms of entertainment that now occupy a strong position within our society, namely role-playing games and video games. Modern role-playing games emerged in 1974 with the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons. They consist in a mix between tactical miniature combat and interpretation of the character created by the player by means of techniques derived from the sessions of collective analysis spread by the 1960s. Video games evolved from 1970s and 1980s tactical adventures and represent the most sophisticated fringe of the technological and cultural revolution brought by computers and digital distribution of information. Video games allow players to have a first-hand experience of the story. They can shape it through their choices, explore the world in which the story is set, and interact with it and with the characters that inhabit it in ways that are becoming increasingly more realistic. From this point of view, video games can probably be considered the most immersive medium through which one can enjoy a narration. This is why fantasy, which is based on the involvement of the reader-viewer in alternate worlds, is so inextricably connected to gaming. Fantasy evolved from a niche genre into a mass phenomenon, and it now dominates every branch of the entertainment industry, both in quantity and in quality. Think about George Martin's books, Guillermo del Toro's movies, and cinematic video games. The fantasy genre is transcending the formulaic structure that had characterized it for a time, and is becoming once again a tool of analysis and reflection. Fantasy stories prompt us to question our reality, presenting us alternative ones. They make us think about matters only apparently distant from us, filtered as they are through the prism of imagination, but that are actually more relevant than ever, even in our world and in our society.